Hi, everybody. This is Jessica. I am here coming to you from Hayden, Idaho, and I'm so excited to be here. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about God's extraordinary timing. And one of the things for me with God's extraordinary timing that I want to talk about is the story of Sarah. And so if you would join me and share with me in this time, we're going to talk for just a handful of minutes about how we can focus our patience and our faith so that we can wait for God's extraordinary timing. So in the Bible, in Genesis, just not too far after Adam and Eve, etc., we see a gentleman named Abram who eventually becomes Abraham. And Abram is married to Sarai, whose name gets changed to Sarah. And I think it's always incredible when everyone's name gets changed in the middle of their lifetime in the Bible, but it happens when God ordains that, and he changes their name for a purpose. So here we have this guy, Abraham, and Sarah have what seems to be a good and blessed life. They have a wonderful relationship with God, but they are struggling because Sarah is barren, which means that Sarah is not able to have children. She has not had any children, and we see other people in the Bible around that time when we see lineage. It'll talk about things like so-and-so was 30 when they had a child. So-and-so was 31 when they had a child. So we understand that when we see that Sarah and Abraham are in their 90s and they have never then had a baby, we can understand that they expect that they're never going to have a child. And so God comes to Abraham and promises Abraham that he will have so many descendants, and that they will be, count them, they're greater than the stars. So we know that Abraham gets this promise, and his wife knows that Abraham has been given this promise that he is going to have descendants. Well, if you're Sarah, you're thinking, how is that possibly going to happen? Because I don't have any kids. And so although Sarah knows God's promise and Sarah hears God's promise, Sarah is lacking maybe in some faith and trust in how that might happen. And so what we see is that Sarah does what I have done. And Sarah takes God's will into her own hands. Sarah says, well, I heard this promise from God, and now I'm going to make it true. And she tells Abraham, well, obviously I'm not going to have any children. So now you need to take my servant, and you need to take my servant as your wife, and you can have babies through her. And that is how God's promise will come true. So Abraham does that. Abraham takes Sarah's servant as a wife, and hi guys, hi Angela. Sarah takes says, take my servant, and Abraham takes her and takes Hagar, and she has a son. And so you're thinking, answered prayers, this is perfect. But Abraham is visited again by God, and in that conversation, these gentlemen who become like tangible conversations and representations of God, Abraham has a conversation with them, and that one gentleman, that God in tangible form says that when I come back next year, Sarah will have had a baby. And Sarah giggles from her tent because she's like, ha, psh. And that guy says, why did you laugh at me? Why did you laugh when I said you would have a baby? And then she's like, I didn't laugh. I didn't laugh. And he says, yes, you did. And the challenge with that is Sarah ends up having a baby. Sarah ends up giving birth to Isaac. Sarah ends up seeing God's promise come true. But in the midst of that, in the waiting, if you will, because she took God's will into her own hands, now she has her husband, has a servant, as a wife, now has a child that is now in competition, in direct competition with her son Isaac, that she has now had. And now she wants to cast this woman out. And because she has created what I also have done in the past, she has created some of her own self-made misery. She has created some of her own self-made complications, if you will. And so with that, I don't know if you guys have ever done that, but I have been impatient with God's timing. And I like to say that God's timing is substantially slower than mine. And I oftentimes tick-tock with God. God makes a promise to me, and then I go, okay, now? Is it now? Is it now? Okay, then I'll just take care of it. Don't you worry, God, I'll take care of it. And there is a difference for us in the fact that we need to understand that when God makes a promise, there is faith. There is faith in the fact that God will make good on his promise to me. And for me, there have even been a couple of times in my life, and very few for me, that I've had what I felt like God ordained moments where God has spoken specifically to me with clarity, like the moments that there's been so much clarity that I know it can't be from me. And that God said, here's what you need to do. And I've received that clear direction. But then you know what I've done with it? I've sat on it. I've sat on it and said, are you sure, God? Are you sure? Okay, what about now, God? Are you sure? And once he gives us a promise, we need to take that moment and we need to walk in faith forward to make sure that we don't take God's will out of his own hands, but that we're going to trust that that clear direction that was given to us becomes something that becomes our motivator and our strength and our confidence as we walk out in faith, knowing that God will fulfill his promise. And here's the deal. Sarah was 90 years old when she had this baby. And so we need to remember that God's timing is often not the same as ours. I like to tell the girls in my high school youth group that God could have created the world with the snap of his fingers. Bam! All of it could have been done. But you know what? He still took 7 days. He is still that intentional. He's still that mindful. He is still that careful in making his word become truth and become reality. And so when we're sitting in the waiting and we're sitting in faith, we want to remember that God is being intentional with us. God is being mindful with us. God is being careful with us, because as humans, we're hasty. As humans, we're quick and we want to move swiftly. But God is intentional and slow and thoughtful. And I want us to remember that we can take that time, that we can be believers of his truth and believers of his promise, and that we can wait. And in the waiting, God is in the waiting. My friend reminded me recently, Jesus is in the waiting, Jessica, and don't forget it. And so today, I don't want you to forget, and I want you to remember too. You know what? When Sarah laughed at God's promise, God did not turn his back on her. God did not say, oh, she's rebuked me. Forget it. I'm out of here. So I want you to know that if you've ever said no to God, or if you've ever giggled at God, if you've ever scoffed at God's promise, that he has not turned his back on you, nor has he turned his back on that promise. Okay, I am here to let you know that God's extraordinary timing in this woman's ordinary life spoke volumes, and that her son and her son's descendants made an impact on the earth that is countless. And I want you to know that that promise that God has made to you, whatever it might be, that he is in the waiting. And that even if you've scoffed in the waiting, that he hasn't turned his back on you. And I want you to know that his extraordinary timing in your ordinary life is going to do countless blessings for those that you may never encounter. God bless you. I look so forward to engaging with you guys in the comments. I'd love to hear, have you ever scoffed at God? Have you ever heard God's promise and taken God's will into your own hands? Or have you ever heard God's promise so clearly, but you still kept asking for confirmation even after He gave it to you time and time again? I have done all of those things, and God loves me anyways. God loves me in spite of it, and He loves you in spite of it all. Remember today that you are loved by a God that is greater than your circumstances. God bless.